Hi everyone, I'm Lana. You've been watching the speakers from the March on Washington for racial justice and police reform. It comes 57 years after Martin Luther King Jr. led his march there and gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Today, the families of Black Americans shot or killed by police are speaking on the same site at the Lincoln Memorial. This year's march has been dubbed by organizers, "Get Your Knees Off Our Necks." It follows months of mass protests against systemic racism and police brutality sparked by the killing of George Floyd, and more recently, the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Dr. Peniel Joseph is joining us now. He's the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where he's also a history professor. So, Professor Joseph, that's where I'd like to start with you now. Can you give us some historic context? We heard, obviously, Martin Luther King quoted several times. We heard John Lewis quoted several times. What did you hear or see today that reminded you of the original March on Washington?
Yeah, I thought there was a lot of stress on love of country. It's very interesting that the NBA coach Doc Rivers said he was exhausted from loving a country that doesn't love us back. But this idea that centering racial justice, centering Black lives, is actually centering American democracy and building the beloved community that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about that Wednesday, August 28th, 1963. So in a lot of ways, this march is a very, very patriotic march. It's a very, very hopeful march. It's a march that is talking about Black humanity and centering Black humanity. And in doing so, we center all of our humanities. So it's very, very hopeful. We do have this generational opportunity right now to end systemic racism, to defeat white supremacy. But violence has always been a part of this country. We can think about racial slavery and the Civil War and Tulsa, Oklahoma, and even the Civil Rights Movement with John Lewis. John Lewis was the victim of violence in 1961 as a freedom rider, and also in 1965 in Selma, Alabama. So we want peace, we want justice, but like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in Letter from Birmingham Jail, he really criticized those who wanted an unjust peace over disruptive calls for justice. So we have to remember that the only reason people organize and demonstrate is not because they want to, but because they have to. They're trying to build and perfect the union and build that beloved community. And what Dr. King said about a beloved community was that it was a community free of racial injustice, free of economic inequality, and free of violence. So that's the community that we want for all of our children, for all of us in this country.
Well, you've written that some of the key takeaways from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech have been overshadowed. Would you mind talking to us about the vision that King laid out for American democracy on August 28th of 1963, and how some of those political seeds are showing up right now?
You know, King lays out an extraordinary vision and a future-looking vision for American democracy, but he says that we're going to have to all struggle together and sacrifice together. He says that we come here to cash a check that has been stamped insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the great vaults of opportunity in America are bankrupt. He also says that now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. He talks about racial slavery in that speech, but he talks about it in a way that we have to look towards the past to move forward. He says he dreams of a day where the sons and daughters of descendants of enslaved African Americans and the sons and daughters of those who owned African Americans could sit down together at the table of humanity. So it's an extraordinary speech, but it's a speech that says that we have to face the past to move forward together. And in that speech, he talks about the racism in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, but also in the North. And he says we're going to have to struggle together, but we're going to have to go to jail together, Black and white. And it's important for all of us to remember, before this present moment of 2020, we had 250,000 Americans, 90,000 white Americans joined with Black Americans to go to the March on Washington and to stand at the Lincoln Memorial and say that they wanted to build another country together. So it was a new beginning for all of us. And so when we see 20 million Americans out on the street in 2020, the origin story there in the immediate context is 57 years ago, we came to march on Washington peacefully to say that the country had to change so that it could move forward. And that struggle continues in our own time.
Well, Professor Joseph, you know, I'm remembering, if I'm remembering my history correctly, Congressman John Lewis, when he spoke at the March on Washington, was told to tone down his speech, his original remarks, so that it was politically acceptable to people who maybe were on the fence or were skeptical of the movement. I'm wondering how you feel like speeches now compare with it. Do you think that people are toning down their rhetoric in order to win over supporters that might be skeptical, or those days are done?
You know, I think it's a combination. I think John Lewis, even with the speech that he ended up giving, was a very, very combative speech. He says that the South is going to be shattered to 1,000 pieces and remade in the image of God and democracy. So these speeches that we've heard today are very, very truthful. They're speaking truth to power. But I'm sure people are still leaving things unsaid, some of the speakers, because they want to build unity. But this idea of Black Lives Matter, which was a controversial slogan 7 years ago, suddenly we have public polling that says people understand now. So the only way you can bring people along is by speaking your truth. And a lot of times people's truth can be offensive, but we have to keep pushing forward, because those of us who are not able-bodied, those of us who are not Black or Latinx or a woman or a trans woman or gay or queer or undocumented, the only way we can understand those folks is by empathizing with them, leading with vulnerability, and being willing to listen to their truths. And that's what Dr. King ends that I Have the Dream speech by saying, that it's when we come together and build that beloved community, the lyrics of My Country 'Tis of Thee, a sweet land of liberty, will take on new meaning. So King is making this argument that the only way we can come together and really understand the founding documents, but also these tributes to American democracy and America being liberty's surest guardian, is by actually living up to our creed, right? And so the idea of justice should not be something that makes people fearful or panic. It should be something that says that we are this world's last best hope, right? Is the United States of America, because we protect the weak. We are for and on the side of the underdog, and we're for human rights for everyone. That shouldn't make anyone fearful. It should make us all proud to be Americans. So what we're seeing in Washington today and in 1963, we're being called to our highest, most aspirational level of citizen. We are all citizens. And if we lead with deep vulnerability and empathy for others, people who we don't know, that's the highest calling of all Americans.
Well, Professor Joseph, I want to play some sound from Congresswoman Ayana Presley. Listen to this.
We are in unprecedented, uncertain times. We are challenged by the state of the nation and the crisis we face, but the state of our movements, it is strong. And another world is possible. Yes, it is possible to legislate justice and accountability. People over profits, joy over trauma, freedom over fear. Yes, it is possible to write budgets that actually value Black lives. If it feels unfamiliar, that's because it has never been done in America. We will meet the moment. We will work towards healing, justice, and collective liberation like our lives depend on it, because they do.
We heard her say, we will meet the moment. I'm wondering if very briefly, because we only have another couple of seconds left, you can tell us about how you feel in this moment, being a Black man, being a professor, a scholar of history, and looking out at this march on Washington.
You know, I feel very hopeful, Lana, and I think that Ayana Presley, this is a brilliant speech, and Black women have done so much to bring us to this period. Black feminist women, Black queer women, Black trans women. And Ayana Presley is really standing on the shoulders of the Ella Bakers and the Shirley Chisholms. And without Black women organizing fiercely and loving this country and all of us so greatly and courageously, we wouldn't be at a point where we can talk about race, class, gender, sexuality, and say that when we center the least of these in this country, we aspire to our best self, right? And so I think that she is a tribute to this country, and this march is a tribute to people who really love America as an ideal and as an aspiration, rather than something that's just mythological and something that doesn't really matter. They're trying to put our creed into practice, and this is what Dr. King said at the March on Washington, too, when he says now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. This is the opportunity that we all have.
All right, Dr. Peniel Joseph, thank you.
Thank you.